Hi everyone. Today I will be the chairperson. Enrique unfortunately couldn't make it due to the strike. Enrique is not on strike. Okay, it's the Nürnberg buses who are, but yeah, it will follow online. So today is my pleasure to introduce Professor Hanna Kokko. She is currently FAUMoD professor in Mainz in evolutionary ecology, right? Since 3 years. She actually has been here already. She gave a very interesting talk about the emergence of sex in biology. And today, actually, she will tell us about how desirable it is to have a long life, evolutionary speaking. So I guess I can give you the floor now.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah, so indeed, it's already the second time that I'm giving a talk here. And I guess the reasoning is that the first time I promised to talk about sex and death. But then there was so much to talk about sex that I didn't have time to talk about death. So then I was invited again to talk about death things. And of course, the long life is relevant because, no matter how long the life is, at some point death will intervene. And to make you think about this, so I am somebody who thinks about diversity of life, not just about human biology, but about all kinds of organisms. So here's in the aging biology field, this is a very famous pair of photos. I took it from a textbook where you can see a young man holding a seabird. And here's the old man, the same man, much later, holding or trying to hold a seabird. And it's also the same bird, same individual bird. And we know that because they have been marked. And as you can see here, Donnet, that's the name of the guy, he looks totally different. He has aged in the intervening 42 years, but the bird looks just like the same. And of course, this is a bit of a cheeky example because birds with their feathers, it's not easy to tell their age. If you looked at some biomolecular markers in their blood, you might see some signs of aging. But it actually is true that if you compare the same body size birds and mammals, the bird probably lives longer. And this is kind of like, this sort of difference is what fascinates me. I also work on organisms that don't really live long at all. So there's, I think right now it's quite close to full moon. And this is a midge species that lives on the European coasts, and it only emerges at new moon or full moon. In between, you don't have them. And every adult lives only 2 hours, and then it's game over. The larvae, of course, live much longer. But because this talk is only less than an hour, I don't actually have time to talk about the midges, but if you have any questions afterwards, I'm happy to mention them as well. But the midges should also make you realize that this diversity in lifespans, you can be successful, evolutionary speaking, even if you're, for example, in the case of midges, your adult life is very short. And this has interested evolutionary biologists a long time. Here are some former group members of mine who have been working on this problem. So if you think about fish species, for example, up there is a Greenland shark that can live hundreds of years. The oldest one swimming around the oceans these days it has been estimated to be potentially sort of 300, 400 years old. This, on the other hand, is a fish species that lives in temporary ponds, and that rainfall sometimes fills and then they dry again. And it has to be able to complete its life cycle really, really quickly because it's dead when the pond dries out. And then it's just the eggs in the mud that create the next generation. So, of course, this already builds intuition that sometimes building a really robust body that can withstand long times, it's pointless if the pond will dry and you're dead anyway. So you invest in something else. So just as a... because I will talk about the bird-mammal contrast a fair bit, I just need to tell you about the albatross called Wisdom. Has anybody heard about Wisdom before? It's a specific individual. It's a female, so I say she. She's the oldest living bird that we know of in the wild. And this is, she has her own Wikipedia page, and there's also social media and all that. And this social media post is from 2 days ago. The update is that, she still returned to the breeding site. This year she didn't lay an egg, but last year she, for example, was successful in her breeding, and this is totally normal for an albatross. So albatrosses have this life cycle of extremely low rate of reproduction, but for that, a really long life. And how old is she precisely? We don't know that because when she was banded, in 1956, she already had adult plumage, so she was at least 4 years old then. So she's about the age of my mother, but my mother doesn't attempt to reproduce anymore. Maybe that's a good thing. But she has kind of like lived all this period of times when evolutionary biologists have been trying to understand the evolution of senescence, the evolution of just sort of giving up and no longer repairing your body to withstand the ravages of time. And there's kind of like a funny XKCD cartoon that it sort of comes in several bits. I'll go through it slowly. That explains really well the evolutionary principles behind aging. So in this hypothetical situation, there's some sort of guy who has done something great, and a booming voice comes from above saying, "For saving my kingdom, I offer you a gift of great power. These magic shoes enable the wearer to outrun death itself. Thank you." And then you look at the shoes, and they have those creepy individual toes. So on the one hand, they make you immortal, but on the other hand, this might interfere with your mating success and reproductive success and whatever. And this is kind of like the joke version of the idea that I will go through also mathematically here. And I will just sort of redefine the product, kind of like, what if you did become immortal, but at the expense of something else, like how well are you going to produce offspring into the next generation? And I will just be a bit more precise by what I mean by this option. Let's say that you magically could avoid becoming senescent, meaning that these aging-related changes wouldn't happen in your body anymore. But this doesn't protect you from those kind of mortality causes that are accidents or something sudden happens. Like, for example, in the sort of society where we live in, we know that your life expectancy would be finite even if the senescence would, all the age-related diseases could be wiped out, because there's always going to be some sort of accidents. And we do know that in modern societies with good health, kind of safety precautions and so on, we die at a rate of about micromort per day, which is a unit that means 1 in a million. So there's a 1 in a million chance that you feel totally healthy and fine today, but tomorrow you're dead from being, you crash your bike really badly or things like that. So the life expectancy for a human that would avoid senescent-related diseases would be about 1 million days, in other words, about 2,700 years. But it would be an exponentially distributed lifespan. And the evolutionary question is, if these extrinsic reasons to die, like your pond dries out, or there's a predator striking, or for humans it could be some sort of armed robbery or whatever, if these sources of mortality increase, does it mean that it shifts the evolutionary balance of how much should you invest in repair as opposed to getting offspring out very quickly early in your life? And this is where this very famous evolutionary biologist, George Williams, he published papers already in the 1950s saying that, yes, there should be an idea that you get these very fast life histories with lots of reproduction in a very short amount of time, even if it wears you down, if its extrinsic mortality is high. Because in that case, building a robust body that can outlast any kind of molecular damages in your body, that would be pointless. So this is called the Williams hypothesis. And people got around testing it, and it's not totally easy to test it with wild data, but there's, for example, from the 80s, here's a fun paper titled "Fly Now, Die Later, Life History Correlates of Gliding and Flying in Mammals." And the idea is that if you can fly, and these are examples, non-bat examples of flying and gliding mammals, then you're maybe better able to escape predation attempts. So therefore, predators are less able to catch you, and therefore maybe you should also otherwise try to reap the benefits of a long life. And what you can see here is that, well, this is very typical in nature, that bigger organisms are longer lived. The line there is not going through these points. That's the whole point, because that regression line is for all the non-flying mammals. And then these examples that manage to fly, they all seem to be quite a bit above the prediction for a non-flying mammal. And of course, this, I already said that this seems to for some reason exclude the bats. Bats are, of course, flying. And there's many more bats than there are these other examples of gliding and flying. So here's a newer analysis of bat longevity. And what happens here is, this is kind of like the evolutionary tree, how different bat species are related to each other. There's a lot of bats. And the branches of the tree are colored according to how much longer does this bat live as opposed to a similar-sized mammal that doesn't fly. The font is a bit small here, so you probably can't see here. If you find a blue case, then there's no difference to others, other categories of mammals, and all the other colors are lots longer lived. So bats really are very long-lived. Some of them hibernate, and it's almost like, that extends the lifespan without it almost like doesn't count, because you can't also produce offspring while you're hibernating, but that really seems to be like the clock stops and then you live very much longer. But also the non-hibernating bats live long. But I'm here talking to an audience that is interested in the underlying maths, so I will slowly go towards the mathematical puzzles that are behind these observations. Because interestingly, those who work on the theory side of things, they don't seem to agree on, or at least until recently, they didn't seem to agree on whether you should even test, whether it makes sense to test ideas like this. And the reason is that some people have said that there's no logical connection between extrinsic mortality and how robust the bodies should be, evolutionarily speaking. It's a logically invalid idea. It's a bit like, if somebody went out and tested if dinosaurs went extinct because of humans doing something. Well, humans didn't exist, so there just cannot be a causality. So if theory predicts no causality for this thing either, then some people would say that, there must be some other reasons behind these patterns. And so I'll explain to you how precisely do theoreticians disagree here. So there are papers titled, for example, "Reports of the death of extrinsic mortality molding senescence have been greatly exaggerated," which is, of course, a bit of a funny title. But this already shows you that, okay, there must be somebody claiming that the idea is dead, and then this person is then defending that the idea is not dead. So here's some sentences from the paper. They claim that the classic theory does not predict an increase in the rate of senescence with an increase in extrinsic mortality is incorrect. When we start making the realistic assumption of a constant population size on an evolutionary timescale, then Williams's intuition is correct, and empiricists have not been misguided. But then there's another paper that responds to the paper on the left, and there's saying that, well, this R equals 0, this is the population growth rate, so this is the assumption of a constant population size, is somehow of special relevance because populations over long periods of time, they cannot sort of keep having exponential growth forever. However, unfortunately for their argument, so these are the guys who believe there's no link, models that explicitly consider how age-independent mortality affects selection in fluctuating age-structured populations with arbitrary growth rates find no effect on selection. So because they say, we can assume something arbitrary, it still works, that there's no causality, this sounds like they have a more general model here in mind, but actually they also make a very important assumption here, is that the mortality acts in an age-independent way. So I'll just sort of clarify what's going on in here. So what precisely is the relevance of all these population growth things and so on? And what I teach my students is this oversimplified life cycle of two different mammals, some sort of a hypothetical rat and a hypothetical bat. And I'm making, for now, an all else being equal assumption, which means that the only thing that differs in their lives is the extrinsic mortality. And for a moment, I'm just sort of going from one discrete breeding attempt to the next. The same thing works in continuous time as well. But let's say that the rat has an 80% chance of dying between each breeding attempt, including from being born to the first breeding attempt. And for the bat, because it can fly away from its predators, it's only 40%. And if we just sort of flip these around, survival as the complementary probability there, And the intuition by Williams is selection to delay senescence is weaker for the rat and stronger for the bat. So, of course, I mean, if you just say that, you know, everybody dies with 80 or 40% until, you know, life is over for them, you don't yet have senescence in the model, because senescence only occurs if you are more likely to die once you're older, right? So there has to be some age dependency in this. So this is kind of like an oversimplified example where, let's say that there's two different genotypes, two different types of rats and bats, and one of them is a rapid senescer, and to make this super simple as an equation, I'm assuming that they can only breed once, then they get a lot of babies out, and then they are too tired and damaged and they die. Whereas if you're a slow senescer, because you have this more robustly built body, then you can breed twice. So in a way, this whole exercise is a no-brainer, because it's always selected for to breed at twice. Twice is always better than once. But the point is that we want to quantify this. That is it true that the bat has experienced a stronger selection to have a robust body? So very simple numbers here. Expected number of times a newborn mouse or bat will breed if it dies after breeding once or twice. We have 0.2 and 0.6. So I switch from the mortality numbers to the survival numbers, obviously for this expectation. And if it dies after breeding twice, then, you know, 0.2, you get the first breeding attempt going, and 0.2 squared, you get the second one on top of that, and similarly for the bat. And if you think about, you know, how would you quantify selection? By how much did the expected lifetime reproductive success increase if you move from the die after first time type to the die after second time type? So there's a 20% improvement versus 60% improvement, and it's not a coincidence that these are exactly the same numbers as the survival. It works for any number, and I just put this here as a numerical example. So it might seem that the case is closed, that the bat is more strongly selected to try to get molecular mechanisms going that act against senescence. But this is actually where the theoretician's argument only starts, because there's people saying that, no, this is too simplistic. And the argument is that if, like I was assuming, the only difference between bats and mice, or bats and rats, is that one of them has a lower survival than the other, then the higher survival species will have a higher growth rate. It just follows from the assumption. If it survives 3 times as well, then, I mean, it's sort of obvious that the population grows 3 times as quickly, but if you're interested in demography, then you can solve the Euler-Lotka equation, which this is actually the reason why I put this oversimplified life cycle in here, because if you keep this small enough, then you can actually create an analytical solution. So what we have here is how to calculate the population growth rate when we know the scheduling of deaths, and then we know at an age-dependent birth rate from the population as well. This must sum up to 1, and you can solve this, and you get equations, very similar looking equations for the mouse and the bats. F here is the number of babies that you get out per breeding attempt. And you can see that the only difference between the solutions is that there's a 3 here for the bat, and there's a 1 here for the mouse. And again, you could put any survival numbers in here, and you can show that this generalizes. So if this high survival of the bats is allowed to translate to population growth, you get exponential growth in both species, but a quicker one for the bat, then you will get, over time, the number of individuals, which is the sort of the width of this trumpet shape, it increases vastly stronger for the bat than for the mouse. This is just a property of exponential growth. A little bit of a difference creates huge differences later. Therefore, if we now think of a particular mother, female bat, female mouse, that places an offspring at a specific year into the population, then that offspring and its offspring, it will give grand offspring to the original mother and so on. There's a certain prediction of what proportion of the population there will be in the future. And if we contrast that with the same mother 1 year later putting an offspring into the population. So this is now the twice breeder. If you have survived to breed another time, you place another offspring into the population, and it has this penalty of having started a bit later. So any point in time, it will actually, its descendants then will form a smaller proportion of the future population than its sibling that was, it's not less fit in any other sense than it was just the earlier sibling has had more time to have its lineage going. And the same is true, of course, for the less strongly growing population, but the difference is more squished because the population growth rate is lower. So this is basically the contrast that we are talking about. And you can put this in equations and you can show the generality of this, and this is what those people who say there cannot be an effect, they have shown that everything cancels out with any example that we put in here. So for this particular example, the lifetime reproductive success, there was a 60% improvement or a 20% improvement if you moved from breeding once to twice for the bat or the mouse. And it seemed to indicate that the bat benefits 3 times as much. For the bat, the late produced offspring have to be devalued much more strongly than for the mouse because they form a smaller proportion of the future gene pool. And evolution is really just bookkeeping what is present in later generations. So therefore, everything cancels out, and we don't, according to these people, find effects on selection. But then you may have been thinking about rats, and you know that they actually have, in reality, they have high growth rates, and they can fill spaces quite quickly. I don't know how much you know about bats, but it is true that they actually have fewer pups per season. But before I even start talking about those differences, because I'm still within the all else is equal model, we have to talk about density-dependent growth, because exponential growth simply cannot go on forever. The sort of jargon that we use in evolutionary biology is a Darwinian demon, which cannot exist. And this is also a brainchild of the same guy, Williams. It's a hypothetical organism that combines all the beneficial traits into its body. So it matures immediately after birth, it survives forever, and it has infinite fecundity. And if you just sort of imagine this sort of creature ever existing, then of course 1 nanosecond later the world looks like this. And because this cannot be the case, we teach our students that at some point growth must become limiting. So if you take, for example, this is from undergrad lectures that I give to people as an exercise. If you think, for example, about whales and what volume of water it displaces, and you know that whales under good conditions, they can have a 3% population growth rate per year. And then you just ask the students to calculate the volume of a whale and ask if they could just keep this 3% growth on without any modifications, how long would it take until you could walk on the backs of whales from here to America, including the depth? It would also be covered in whales. And I don't know what your intuition, you're mathematicians, so you know that exponential growth is always crazy, but it would take less than 900 years. And of course, in reality, whales have existed or whale-like things have existed for a lot longer than 900 years, and they have not displaced the seawater. I mean, where would the carbon come from? And that's kind of like the whole point. And in case you are interested in the real biology, like this is a whale paper, what you have here on the x-axis is blubber thickness. So whales have this sort of thick fat layer, which is an indication of how well they have been feeding. And if it starts dropping below 8-7 centimeters here in this particular whale species, then the females just don't become pregnant, which is of course sensible as an evolutionary strategy, because if you are not able then to feed the young really well, it would be probably better to conserve energy and wait for better times. Humans, by the way, behave similarly, human females. And just because, I'm a biologist and not just working on the theory, I just love this sort of paleo art. If you saw this sort of whale phylogeny, where do whales come from? So this is an artist's depiction of what whale-like lifestyles looked like 43 million years ago, based on fossil finds. So they became oceanic afterwards. But even back then, they were not able to fill the oceans and the shores and all that. So therefore, people are arguing about the importance of relatively stable population sizes over long periods of time. And this is why those sentences were there in these papers. So we shouldn't use this sort of model to make evolutionary predictions if it's impossible for populations to be for really prolonged times in such exponential growing phases. And this would be a much more realistic way to model things. And here, if I do the same exercise with a mother who places offspring into the population at different times, now you see that because there's this stability, there's no difference. There's no devaluing of the later produced offspring anymore that you have to do in your bookkeeping. So now if we say that, the bat is 3 times as likely as the rat to survive to breed another time, and it can also keep the benefits because each offspring is equally valuable, then maybe we can rescue William's hypothesis. So the bat appears to be safe from the cancelling effect here, but there's actually a bit of a but here as well, because somebody might say that, hey, I just contradicted myself. I said that every bat can survive so much better than the mouse, but then I also said that, well, the population is not growing. So the high survival should not be felt in the population growth rate. And this is possible to have a sort of consistent model that has this, but then something has to suffer, and maybe they can't actually make the offspring happen anymore. So maybe when the population tries to grow, the offspring production suffers so that things are kept at equilibrium. So an equilibrium is always achieved via some mechanism that hinders some optimal performance in some part of the life cycle. So the reducing population growth rate from this growing to the non-growing, we can't just have an independent parameter that is dialed down in the model. Something has to change in the participants' lives. Some existing individuals must die or be more likely to die, or they must reproduce less well. So we then went on to model different ways that this bottom-up population growth thing can happen. Gives us also the opportunity to remember that bats and mice actually differ in quite a lot of different things. So in the next model, let's just contrast within a same hypothetical species. Now I don't care if it's a bat or a rat or a human or whatever, but we just contrast 2 different life histories, 2 different strategies, genotypes. One of them acts faster in its life than the other one. So the fast one senesces according to these curves, which are derived from Gompertzian mortality schedules. Gompertz may come to be exact, and I will explain to you in a moment what this is, if you haven't heard about that. But because it senesces, it has been doing that because it has also produced a lot of offspring per time unit. Whereas then there's also a slow genotype that has a more sluggish reproductive rate, so it saves energy, and as a reward for that, it effectively has both these shoes. So it's immortal in the sense of its lifespan is exponentially distributed, just like human lifespan would be exponentially distributed with 2,700 years if you could avoid senescence. So the Gompertz aging curves, which are all the ones that are not in the dashed line, they are based on Benjamin Gompertz's formulation. The Maycam term is the extrinsic mortality term that you can see there in the mu naught. And he was a human demographer, and he noticed a pattern in human mortality data. And later, people have confirmed this over and over again, and it also fits other species quite well. So the x-axis range varies, but it fits a surprisingly large number of organisms. So there's if you put things on a log scale and you look at the mortality rate, there's a bit of a peak at teenage years, but thereafter, when people have stopped doing silly things that teenagers do, then you can see a sort of steady uptick in mortality as life progresses. It's a bit lower mortality for women than men at any age, but the shape is extremely linear on a log scale. In other words, it's an exponentially increasing mortality risk with age. And these shapes are, like I said, they're quite generalizable. So this is just primate data, and so this is now not the mortality rate, but this is the proportion of individuals surviving. So Gompertz basically looks like, you know, some sort of shapes like this. So very often you have very high mortality in the first year of life. It used to be the case in humans as well. So for example, Sweden, old data, whereas Sweden, new data, we have managed to avoid the kids' mortality, but then of course there's this unavoidable decline at a certain age later. So if we model it this way, that either you avoid senescence, but then you can't reproduce so well, or you accept senescence, but then you cannot, you know, then you can churn out more offspring per time unit. And we again, you know, this is just the assumptions that we do here. Then we can start asking questions about how the population regulation, density-dependent population growth impacts things for different species. With three different questions. One is, how big should the fecundity penalty for slow be for fast to be the overall winner, even though the fast ones die younger? So it's really about the trade-off of reproduction versus mortality. Does the answer to question one depend on what we assume about extrinsic mortality? This is the unavoidable part of mortality, the mu naught. Because if it depends, then William was right. And if it doesn't depend on it, then those people criticizing him were right. And the question number three is, does the answer to Q2 depend on population regulation and how it's implemented? For example, this pregnancy reduction in whales when they're not so well fed is one option, but there's very many other options out there. So all the figures that I'm showing you, they are basically arranged in the following way. We assume that the extrinsic mortality might be anything from low to high, and then we assume something about the relative fecundity of slow. So remember, these slow things like albatrosses, they don't breed very often. They only have one chick at a time, but for that they will get a long life. But how much slower do they have to reproduce to get this benefit? This is what we vary on the y-axis. And it's kind of obvious that at the very top of this graph, slow always must win, because at the very top, the fecundities are not different at all. The reproductive rate is the same, but the slow lives longer, so it's selected for. Whereas if it cannot reproduce at all at the bottom, then fast must win, because its competitor has fitness 0. So there must be some line in between where the fates switch, where one starts winning and the other one doesn't. So the questions are really about this line. So if it's flat, like hypothetically I've drawn here, then, well, question number one, you know, this is just the ratio, seems to be 0.5 or something like that. And because it's flat, there's no effect of extrinsic mortality, so Williams in this case would be wrong. And question number three is then, do we always get a flat line, or does it depend on what we assume about population regulation? So it's conceivable that we might also get a curve like this, so that when extrinsic mortality is really high, then you get fast lives evolving. This is the intuition of Williams. It might also be that Williams has to turn in his grave, that, you know, maybe we get a relationship, but it's the wrong way around. And it's not immediately obvious how and why this would happen, but it actually did come out as an outcome sometimes. So what we did was to think about more or less realistic ways how this could be modeled. So we need population regulation, which means we need life becoming harder when there's high density. And we have three different categorical options for it. It could be age-independent survival, so that if it's really high density as a population, nobody's feeding very well and everybody's dying with a higher rate. Or it could be that it's the old ones, which in this case we just make the mature ones from age 1 onwards, that they suffer more, or it's the young ones that suffer more. So maybe the recruitment means, can you actually proceed from being an egg to being a member of the population as an adult? Or fertility means that, you know, even the egg doesn't happen. So maybe it's the young ones that suffer, or their production suffers when densities are high, just like in the whale case. And then what we have on the columns here, we have sort of a total of 9 + 1 cases. We could have some deterministic, pulsed, probabilistic pulsed, or continuous way that this density acts. So it could be, for example, that even at high density, everything is fine until a disease comes through. So this would be probabilistic and pulsed. Or maybe very deterministically, once the population size exceeds something, then the disease comes. And this is deterministic pulsed. Continuous is then a much sort of smoother transition from easy life to tough life. And the final case that we only have for the recruitment part here in the bottom, this is competition for territories, simply because a lot of, for example, birds act this way. There's a certain number of nest sites, certain number of territories, and if there's more birds than nest sites, then, you know, a certain number of them get lucky and the rest cannot. And if there's very many birds, then of course there's more unlucky ones who can't breed. And then we just put the outcomes. You know, this is the curves that I was promising. And you can see that we can find flat cases. This happens. We also can find negative cases. So this is the anti-Williams. That also happens. And then we find the positive cases. And they are really neatly organized according to who we were assuming will suffer when densities get high. So we have the sort of null scenario where, if you now remember, half an hour ago I was telling you that there was this claim about a very arbitrary, very general model, but they said that, well, we assume age-independent suffering. And if this is the case, then yes, you can show that the lines are always going to be flat. But there are these other options. If it's the old individuals that suffer first, we get the anti-Williams, and if it's the young ones that suffer first, we get the Williams. And what we ended up writing in the paper then is the, just sort of, we also go through the causalities involved here a bit, but the Williams prediction is likely to hold whenever density dependence hurts juveniles, either by making it difficult for adults to produce them in the first place or making their survival or recruitment low. And because empirically, you know, everything from the bat studies to the fish studies and so on, there has been rather strong support for the Williams-type patterns across species. So we think that this theory work is then indirect evidence that maybe it is very often in nature that the juveniles are the first to suffer when the going gets tough. And if you just pull up this again, like this is just primates, but you can see that it is quite a natural pattern that juvenile survival is poor to begin with. This is not yet evidence of what we were talking about, strictly speaking, because we would also require that it drops even more, relatively speaking, when there's a tough year. But at least this kind of like shows the biologist intuition that the very beginning of life tends to be tough in nature. Okay, I'll mention a few other things here still. So one is this Gompertz law. Because it's just sort of, you know, I just said that, well, it seems to fit very nicely, but why does human mortality follow that pattern? And why is there evidence that it seems to follow that pattern in many other species as well? We are not the first ones to think about this. There are, for example, this is a paper from a couple of years ago. And if you read the title, it's an idea that there's some sort of interdependencies in the body. Like at a very coarse level, like if my lungs start failing, then the heart has to work harder, and then the heart might also have a higher failure rate and all that. But you could also go through the molecular pathways that if something is imbalanced here, it's harder for the other systems to keep the problems at bay and all that. And if you then sort of start counting these failures, then you can quite easily get to Gompertz patterns. And Shikara Bhatt, who is a PhD student in my lab at the moment, he's sort of interested in being a bit more explicit about the fact that individuals might differ in how, kind of like how good cards were they given at the beginning of life, and therefore when you start having individuals dropping into the unobservable state, and you only make data collection among the living ones, then these are the kind of like equations that he's now working on. It's a bit too unfinished right now for me to talk about that very much, but he's super interested in this, and if I came here a year later, I would probably tell you more. But instead of going through that maths, I thought I will tell you a little bit about the bird-mammal comparison still. Senescence is it's very hard to avoid completely. There's always something happening, like any person of this age distribution that I have in the audience here, you probably already have some mutations somewhere in your cell lineages that might later accumulate even more mutations, and then you get cancer. And it's very hard to get rid of even that one cause of mortality. Cancer affects all life. I put here an example of a person. This is David Attenborough, who this year will turn 100 in May. Let's hope that he makes it. But the point is that we know that when a human being is already 99 years old, that everybody starts getting a bit nervous, like, will he make it to May? Whereas for a person of your age, you probably don't worry very much about whether you will make it to May. So what is it that has made bodies so vulnerable to problems that impact life at advanced ages? So the concept that I haven't mentioned here yet is a sort of conceptualizing of how the force of selection declines with age. And the force of selection is defined in the following way. If you had a mutation that from a particular age onwards only has a positive effect or a negative effect, how strongly does natural selection see that compared to the same mutation affecting your entire life from newborn onwards? And this has to decline with age because, so the metaphor is that the selection is really in a shadow. It cannot see the organism's performance very well because a large part of the cohort has already died before even reaching that age. And many offspring have already been produced unimpacted by that mutation if it only starts acting from a late age onwards. But importantly, it's not necessarily the same curve as the proportion of individuals still alive, because fertility schedules also vary a lot. And we need to contrast both the schedules of mortality and fertility in order to get the outcome of the force of selection. And here we wanted to contrast different bird species, different mammal species, but the problem is that we want to make contrasts of the shape, like is there really evidence that only a small proportion of organisms might enter a selection shadow of a particular shade of gray, so to speak. But the temporal dynamics on the x-axis is wildly variable between species. So like a blue tit here, which I already saw this morning in Erlangen, if you get a 2-year-old, it's already a really long-lived one. Whereas an albatross, as we have seen, can live much longer. So how do we actually scale the x-axis? Also, you notice that the force of selection calculations, it has a flat bit at the beginning, and that's because before the age of maturity, there's no difference in when the mutation has an impact. It's always equally strongly selected, because if it hampers your chances of ever becoming mature, it doesn't matter if it did so a week after you're born or 5 weeks after you're born. So these are some numbers for the albatrosses. If we make a modification of the x-axis, this is basically what we have done for this empirical data set, is we take some information about them. Albatrosses start breeding at about 7 years of age, and the generation time, defined as the average age of a mother when she's laying an egg, that is approximately 15 years. And then we go to this transformed age. So at age of maturity, we want transformed age to be 0, because that's when your reproductive life starts. At generation time, we want it to be 1, and then you just sort of keep the clock ticking from that onwards. So we get this very simple transformation. So for example, Wisdom with her 74 years has an adjusted age of 8.375. So an adjusted age of 1 would be that she's as long as, at the generation time, so she's really quite an exceptional one. But this solves the problem that it's very hard to compare across species when like these are two hypothetical non-senescing species. There's a fast one where the cohort disappears very quickly, and then there's a slow one where it does so slowly. But they're both non-senescing in the sense that there's no Gompertzian or any other shape of starting to drop faster than the exponential. So when we do the transformation, then they both actually become exactly exponential. So we can then contrast every species against this null model. And we can show here some hypothetical cases that if you, for example, have strong survival senescence, then you will deviate from the exponential in this particular red manner. And we collected data from the literature, from different mammals, different birds as well. I put a French woman here because it was a French women data set that we used for this. And then we can start putting things on axis. So what we can show, for example, is that short-lived species have a smaller proportion of individuals ever entering the shadow. And the shadow, of course, darkens gradually, so we just chose a certain cutoff point, and it's sort of arbitrary. You can do this for any cutoff point that you want. I think this was 50% darkening that we chose. And you can see there's a positive correlation. You can also see that the birds, when you do your stats properly here, then the birds actually are lower than the mammals. So birds senesce less than mammals. Or you can quantify the expected proportion of your life that you, calculating from newborn onwards, that you will experience in the shadow. And again, it's an increase. Again, the birds are lower than the mammals. But in this particular one, you see two outlier dots. And this is interesting because these are humans and killer whales. And the reason, we think, is that these are two of the very small number of mammal species that have menopause. So you are in the shadow because you're no longer reproducing as a female. This is all female data, by the way. But your life keeps going on. And why humans and killer whales and some other whale species have evolved such long lifespans, this is an entire topic in evolutionary biology, has to do very much with the fact that grandmothers let's just talk about killer whales, they are incredibly good providers for their clans, so to say, particularly for their male offspring who don't really learn to hunt themselves. They're always relying on their mother or grandmother. To a weird degree. I'm getting a bit sort of distracted here, but it's just so cool for you to know. The males, they never leave home. They only go elsewhere to fertilize other females, and then they come back to mama and say, give me a fish. If mother dies, then an adult son might be 30 years old, but they have 800% elevated mortality in the next year because they haven't really learned to be independent. So these are quite unique cases where the sort of social life is incredibly important here. But to come back to the sort of overall pattern here, which is that it may be counterintuitive to you that short-lived species are actually the ones who avoid senescing. I mean, they die quickly, but that's almost entirely extrinsic mortality. If you're a bit older, it doesn't predict that you're going to be dead any more than if you're a bit younger in these species. So they behave a bit like radioactive particles that also have this memoryless property. Whereas it's the long-lived species that do live all the way until you are in a dark shadow, and then you are more likely to die when you're old than when you're young. So therefore, if I had to make an educated guess of how to analyze these data even more in detail, like looking at the biomolecular markers and all these kind of things in the bloods, I would say that this one that doesn't live very long, it would be very hard to find evidence of true senescence in it. And that was really it. I didn't get to the insect story. It's quite cool, but I just wanted to keep the talk finite. So I will thank all these people. There's some take-home messages in there about evolution biology, that all else being equal, yes, it's nice to live longer, but the whole point of evolution biology is that very often all else is not equal. And therefore, for example, fast species may actually senesce slower and all this kind of other things. Shikarabat, I didn't put a picture of him here because he deserves a picture of his own because of the new award that he got. This is the same journal that publishes the Ig Nobels, and he submitted, they have a subsection of the Luxuriant Flowing Hair Club for Scientists, and he got membership there, so we are quite proud of him. So thank you for listening.
Right, so thank you very much for the talk, first of all. Are there any questions in the audience? I do have one.
Yeah, okay.
No one is asking. So, okay, so my question is actually quite basic, but just to understand the models that you showed, especially in the part with fast and slow, you know. So these are models for one single species, right? So the course you were plotting, right? And are there any studies that you know of, or you know, even trials or tests that you have done where you have two different species interacting? And would that be too difficult? Because obviously, I mean, while very interesting, like biology is all about, right, interactions between different species, right? So why can a slow species live in the same, you know, habitat of another maybe fast species, right? So
a coexistence question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is. No, it's not too difficult. It just wasn't the scope of, you know, that particular thing. But it's interesting that the midge story is actually precisely about that. And I'll just I don't want to take too many minutes about this, but yeah, exactly. I'll talk about insects. But this is a coexistence question because maybe I should explain the physics here a little bit because it lives on tidal shores, and insects are not very often marine, but this one is, in the sense that the larvae are in the water, in the seawater. That's where they develop. They're attached to the bottom and then the adults. So then they pupate, and then the adults wait for cues, which is the moonlight and the wave action of the tides, because as you probably know, the full moon and the new moon provide the lowest low tides. These are called spring tides. And that's when the insects emerge. And it's quite easy to understand why they have to synchronize, because if you only live 2 hours, it's quite important to find a mate quickly and lay the eggs, and then the water comes back and they are dead. So that they choose the same signal is nice. But it's a bit more tricky to understand why there's the full moon type, there's the new moon type, and these are roughly equivalent. That's fine. You can reproduce once a month. But then there's also the so-called semilunar one, which can use either moon, new or full. But of course, each adult only once, because then they're dead. And this is, in a way, the more impatient strain, because it has reproductive opportunities every 2 weeks. The other one have to wait a full month. And if you think about having to wait a full month, it means 2 weeks more of danger if you have to be in the water. On the other hand, it might also mean 2 weeks more of trying to grow larger before you then go for it in these 2 hours. And I don't know what your intuition tells you, but people might think that, well, the pros and cons, if they balance nicely, then we can explain coexistence. But if we actually put coexistence in the model, it's really hard. It's kind of like, if you make the survival advantage a bit too big, then the impatient strain wins. No, the other way around. The size advantage are really big, then the patient one wins. But if it's too small, then the impatient one wins, and all that. And the coexistence question, it was an entire PhD trying to understand how come we can have both, all three types in there. These are genetically determined. And the answer seems to be, in the end, and this was also, we had to go to the, there's some stuff, triangles, nice. The answer seems to be that the new moon strain, it doesn't actually use exactly the new moon. It emerges a little bit earlier, a few days earlier. And that means that the title of the paper is that this is an insect that converts time into space because it, by shifting its arrival or its emergence time a little bit, it actually ends up a little bit higher on the beach. because the water hasn't gone quite as low. So if we look at, this is this is France here, and this is where the insects are, and we do the genotyping at different locations and relate that to the water depth, then we can see that biological data is always messy, but the lower you go, the more full moon-like you are. And spatial coexistence works theoretically so much better than temporal coexistence, so therefore we can link it with sort of general eco-evolutionary theories. But it's quite a fun story.
Thank you. Are there other questions? All right, so...
Oh, there's...
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Do you want Wait, let me pass the microphone. Yeah. Sorry, this is for...
Yeah, I was wondering, because there were some animals that didn't fit these curves, these anomalies, do you think that because evolution is an ongoing process, they haven't converged yet to these nice equilibria?
You mean this graph?
Yeah.
Yeah, so biology is a bit like that. There's this concept of physics envy where you can sort of get your prediction and then your data points are extremely well there. Why there is so much variation, like I think that, for these particular cases, we can think that these are really outliers because they have menopause, so there's a very sort of clear explanation for this. But otherwise, kind of like, why mammals are above birds, I think I have good explanations for those. But why this certain particular bat is, for example, longer lived than another bat, then you have to go to bat-specific features. And I already mentioned that, for example, hibernation seems to prolong lifespan without kind of like, you just sort of, you don't really decay because you're not really doing anything in your body and you're at cold temperature and all that. So then you have to start going to the fact that your model just doesn't capture everything that is important for the species. But since I mentioned that birds are different from mammals, there's very many ways that they differ. They have this extreme metabolic demands of the flight, and they are dealing better with antioxidant. The sort of whole antioxidant story works better in birds than in mammals. They also have better designed lungs. Like in our lungs, there's just this stale air at the bottom that never sort of, it's very hard to get an airflow through, but they have these extra sacs of air so that they can breathe on the way in and on the way out and all that. But my favorite difference between birds and mammals is that birds came from dinosaurs, and not the really biggest ones, but like quite big ones, like 200 kilos, whereas mammals grew from being small to being large. And when you think about something like, for example, resistance against cancer, which affects all life. If you are a big-bodied thing, you need very good defenses against cell replication errors because you have many cells. So just kind of like, probabilistically, something's going to go wrong. And even within a species, every 10 centimeter that a human being is bigger, you get 10% more cancer, particularly bone cancers and things like that. So it's a real thing that is impacting all life. And birds, if they were dinosaurs, they must have had pretty good adaptations to being big, and it's easier to become small because many of your problems are just gone than it is to become big from having been small. So cancer biologists, they are really interested in elephants and whales right now for the reason that these guys have somehow solved a problem quite recently that smaller bodied mammals haven't. And I could go on about the details of exactly whales solve the problem in slightly different ways from mammals and all that. But the way that a particular species that is right now a certain body size may have had an evolutionary history of being smaller than bigger, this might be part of the explanation what's going on in here.
Are there any other questions? Maybe it's also time to go. Unfortunately, today we are a bit short on the timing, so we need to leave now. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for listening. Yeah.